This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken from K-State start today's show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode where they chat about feral swine in Kansas and the management of them. K-State livestock entomologist Cassandra Olds continues the show as she describes this year's ticks and the common concerns for animals and humans. Ending the show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk as he discusses the importance of employee training on dairy farms. He says surveys show employees prefer hands-on training with a coworker or manager. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. Today, they're discussing feral swine.
We have ourselves a terrestrial episode today, and Drew, I think you're going to talk to us about some swine that you may have seen recently on a trip down south. So what do you got in store for us today?
Well, yeah, I mean, this last week I was in San Antonio with the K-State shotgun team, so drove through the hill country down in the Edwards Plateau region to Texas, and then went south of San Antonio a little bit too for a little excursion, and just saw lots of feral swine while I was down there. Lots of damage at the National Shooting Complex where the shotgun team was shooting. Also saw some agricultural damage in rural areas. I almost hit some pigs on my way home. I was leaving the little town of Breckenridge, Texas, and as I was on the north side of the town, I think it was an extension office, actually, a Texas AgriLife extension office. A sounder of pigs ran out from behind it in front of me in the middle of the night, and I about whacked them.
Where are they found? I mean, are their populations expanding rapidly with those kind of numbers, or are they just in the South? Who needs to worry about them?
Well, I mean, they're throughout North America. There are wild pigs in California. There are wild pigs in Canada. I believe there are populations in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So they're sort of throughout North America. But the areas where they're causing the most damage and the areas that they're the most abundant would be sort of from Kansas south. If we think about what that means, there's 35 states at least with populations of feral swine, at least 6 million individuals in the United States. So that's based on the most recent estimates I've seen. It could be a little higher now. I'm not sure.
Well, it wouldn't take it very long to get higher with the way they're reproducing.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And, all those pigs, they do a lot of different things to cause damage for agricultural producers. More than $2.5 billion in damage is the most recent estimate I've seen. I think that was from 2024 maybe, and so that's a little bit old.
Sure.
But lots and lots of damage to agriculture.
What's this damage? Are they just eating so much, or what are they doing to damage these crops?
That's the main thing. So they go out and they do a lot of rooting, and when they're rooting, of course, they're eating plant material that's in the ground. They're probably also eating grubs and stuff like that too. I don't know their biology well enough to know that for sure.
Sure.
So that's me talking. That's not me as a scientist. But they do a lot of digging. They'll go along rows of newly planted corn or newly sprouted corn and just basically vacuum up all the plants in those rows.
So what do you mean they're digging? These corn plants.
Yeah, when they're rooting, they're using their nose a lot of time. I mean, they're sort of plowing with that nose. I mean, if you can, I'm sure, get online and see videos of domestic pigs rooting around with their nose and that sort of thing. I'm sure they also paw a little bit when they're doing that rooting, but a lot of that activity would be with their head.
And I've seen some fields where you've seen that, and it looks like a rototiller literally has gone through, and like you mentioned, it could be right after planting. They seem to like it when plants are relatively small, going through and doing that as well. But quite a bit of damage. And so, I mean, you said a couple $2.5 billion, right? So that's a lot of damage themselves. Other than agriculture, what other types of things are they causing problems in?
Well, they will absolutely get into urban areas too. They like to eat plants that we might have in our yards. They will root in people's yards and that sort of thing too. There's lots of collisions. I drive down to Texas several times a year, and it's not uncommon for me to start seeing roadkill pigs when I'm just past Oklahoma City on the interstate, and then I'll see roadkill pigs along the big drainages kind of all the way to San Antonio from there.
So lots of car damage, potentially, some deaths related to accidents, I would assume. And, do they attack anything? Are they docile and just eating stuff? What are they doing in that realm?
No, they're mean. So they will attack people. They will attack pets. They also will prey on livestock. So just kind of the same things that we think about with coyotes, newborn calves, newborn lambs, goat kids, and then also females while they're giving birth can be attacked and injured or killed by these feral swine. Deer fawns, too. They're going to be a predator of deer fawns in those areas where they're at. And so those are challenges. They also spread a lot of disease. So there's more than 30 viral and bacterial diseases that they can spread. A lot of those are zoonotic, so they can be transmitted to humans. They'll also transmit diseases to livestock. African swine fever is a really important one that they can spread. So lots of challenges associated with these critters.
Yeah, it really sounds like they can be devastating. I think, just thinking about other areas they might be, I've heard of causing problems with planes that are maybe taking off and landing.
Yeah.
And so, when you get really high numbers, they start to be everywhere. And so they're mean. They're attacking a bunch of stuff. They can potentially spread diseases. So sounds like not something that we necessarily want to have around in very high numbers, right? So is there anything we can do to control for that at all?
Sure, and the control piece of it is really counterintuitive. We tend to think about using recreational hunting as a control method for species that people like to hunt. And recreational hunting of feral swine is really popular. In the places where recreational hunting is allowed, there are opportunities for that recreational hunting that we don't see with a lot of other species. In Texas, for example, where I was just at, people can pay for the opportunity to hunt them out of helicopters.
Oh, wow.
You can also hunt them with thermals and night vision and that sort of equipment, which can be fun. Hunting them with dogs is also fairly popular. You can absolutely trap them. The problem is that when we hunt them recreationally, people enjoy it so much that they want to have more opportunity. And when you combine that with the fact that their fecundity is so high that we almost can't keep up with the population through any recreational hunting. And in fact, we can't keep up with the population growth through recreational hunting. And so recreational hunting tends to actually cause expansion of feral swine rather than to help control it. And when we look at states that have tried to control them, Kansas is actually kind of an outlier. We are referred to from a lot of states around the country as the Kansas model of control. In 2004, there were 16 counties occupied by feral swine in Kansas. Now, there are 9. And we're one of the only states, not the only, but one of the few states from our latitude south that has fewer counties occupied now than we did in 2004. And the reason that we've been successful is there's no recreational hunting here. And that, again, surprises a lot of people. People wonder why that works. But basically, they're not a huntable wildlife species here. Kansas Department of Agriculture has the authority over management of feral swine, and they contract with USDA Wildlife Services, and they're very, very effective at trapping them. And they really focus on, it's called whole sounder removal. And so we've got these new trapping technologies where we've got cameras on the traps that have live view, and we can control the trap remotely. And so an operator would get a message on their phone that says, there's something in your trap right now. And they would look, and they'd look at the live view, and they'd see, okay, there's 3 pigs in there. But I want to make sure that I don't close the trap until I've got the whole sounder. So they're going to wait And they've been watching, they've been baiting for a while before they arm the trap, and they're seeing how many pigs are coming, how many piglets, how many adult sows, how many boars. But the boar's not typically going to be in that sounder group, so they're looking how many sows and how many piglets should I see in there before I go ahead and close the trap. And then once the whole sounder's in there, they drop it.
And when you're talking about these traps, are they like big conibear traps, live traps? And what does this trap look like?
Yeah, so the best explanation is probably a corral trap. And there's lots of different designs. There are designs where you've got a whole bunch of panels that are connected that would be on a raised system. And when you trigger it, then that whole group of panels would be in a circle or an octagon, and it drops down on top of them and encloses them. There are other designs like that have a door that they would all enter and then be in that confined area. And so those would be the remotely triggered designs. The non-remotely triggered designs that can also remove whole sounders, there's one trap that is made out of sort of like batting cage netting. And it's got a weight on the bottom of it and like all the way around the ring on the inside. And then there's also some stakes that would hold that bottom close to the ground so they can get underneath of it, but it's folded in a little bit at the bottom, and so they're not smart enough. They just walk until they hit the net and they're pushing on it and they can't get out. They could still, if they could figure it out, they could get underneath that seam. But so there's no door. They're just going under the net to get in, and then they're standing on the net when they're trying to get out, basically.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken. If you'd like to hear this full podcast episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about ticks with K-State livestock entomologist Cassandra Olds. Cassandra, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, excited. Ticks my favorite. Nobody's favorite except mine.
I'm glad someone's here to do it for us. And as we're talking about ticks, part of the reason I feel like they're out earlier than usual. And is that the case?
That is the case. And what's scary is last year we did an episode on this and we said, hey, they're out earlier than usual. And there was that the year before too. So we've actually had 3 years now where they've come out earlier than usual, right? And so each year we've gotten warm earlier. And so they have this nifty ability to detect the sunlight hours and also increase in temperature. So they're like, hey, spring's early, I'll come out from overwintering. So they are out early, and it's because we had this really, really warm spring and really early on.
And does the winter that we had also impact their willingness to come out earlier?
Yeah, we had in tick sense, we had a fairly mild winter. We didn't have terribly cold conditions, and what we really need is that prolonged freezes to make sure that we kill off as many ticks as possible. So we had a milder winter, which means more ticks probably survived and made it through the overwintering period. And now it's early spring, so they're coming out. And, everybody I've spoken to has been noticing them come out earlier. Something to keep in mind also is that, a tick may take 2 to 3 years to go from an egg to an adult. And so what we'll see year on year, we'll see quite big differences in our number of ticks, right? People will be like, oh, we didn't have many ticks, the year before last or something like that. Now all of a sudden we have a whole lot of ticks. And that's because really the tick population that we have today is accumulation of what our weather conditions were like for the past 2 years, right? So we've had 2 warm years in a row, which means that it's really conducive for ticks. And so we'll probably have worsening tick populations coming out this year.
And thinking about temperatures, in March, I feel like there's a lot of prescribed burning. Does that have any impact on them?
It does. I tell you, we've been driving up and down Kansas, giving a lot of talks on Asian longhorn tick, which is invasive and has been now detected in Kansas. And I've been driving past a lot of burnt fields, and I get so happy every time because I'm like, no ticks, no ticks, no ticks. right? So burning is one of the most effective way to control ticks, especially if you do it in the spring. Sort of the catch for this is that you've got to do it before it warms up, right? So if we're burning right now, people have ticks on them, livestock already have ticks on them. And so we miss that window where, you want to get them before they come out. So when it's still super, super cool. Once they've come out, a lot of these ticks have now found hosts, because ticks don't wait for us to put our cattle out onto, the pasture. They're just waiting for something, and they'll take a deer, they'll take a bunny, they'll take whatever they want. And so, yeah, burning does significantly reduce your tick population, but we want to make sure that we're burning really early on in the spring, or the other option is late in the fall.
Do you see a certain species that they prefer to, per se, attach to first?
No, so each tick species has its own sort of preference. The problem is that one of the most abundant tick in Kansas is the Lone Star tick, which really isn't too fussy. It'll climb on anything. And that's part of the reason why it's been so successful, is that it doesn't wait for its preferred host to come along. It's also a fairly aggressive tick. So most ticks wait on their blade of grass and hope that somebody comes and finds them, right? And not everybody's going to be lucky. Whereas the Lone Star tick is very aggressive, and it will actually, if it smells carbon dioxide, it will actually move towards the carbon dioxide. And this is how we trap ticks. We put a plate with dry ice on it, and we just wait an hour, and we come back, and there's ticks everywhere. So they will walk towards the dry ice, which is just carbon dioxide, thinking that it's an animal. And so they're very, very aggressive. The other one that people need to be on the lookout for is the Asian longhorn tick. We've had a confirmed identification out of Kansas, and a dog that had no history of travel. As we're speaking to people more and more, and things that they're describing, we probably have it in multiple locations in the state. So this is just a brown tick. It's brown throughout its life stage. It looks very similar to the American dog tick, which we do have in Kansas. But the thing to note is that you're going to have higher than normal tick populations, right? And I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of ticks. So if producers are seeing very, very, very high tick burdens, either in the pasture or on their animals, they can give me a call, and we'll come out and take a look and see what's going on.
And can you remind us, what are the concerns with the Asian longhorn ticks?
Yeah, and so the concern with this is that it transmits Theileria orientalis. And so this is the causative agent of bovine theileriosis, and we see pretty high mortality rates with that. And so it's what we call a biological vector. And so what this means is that when a Asian longhorn tick feeds on an infected animal, and we only worry about our cattle, this isn't infectious to anything else, it can take in a small amount, but it replicates within the tick so that the tick, when it feeds again during the next life stage, gives more of it out. And so you can have a higher dose coming out of a tick than went into the tick. And so because of this, if you have a large number of ticks feeding on an animal that's never seen this disease before, it gets a really high dose of it, which means the immune response can't really cope with it really well. And that's when we see clinical disease.
So what are some control options for ticks?
Ticks are a little bit tricky to control. Number one, burning early on in the spring will significantly reduce your numbers straight out the gate. You only get protection for that burning season, right? So if you burnt in January, not January, but recently, you only get protection for 2026. Your protection doesn't go into 2027. So that's the one thing. Getting rid of those eastern red cedars is a really big deal. That's a tick hotspot. If I ever want to go survey anywhere for ticks, I look for the closest eastern red cedar and I go straight there, right? Get rid of those eastern red cedars. They are tick magnets. We want to also make sure, going back to the burning, that if you've got areas that are green, that got green really early, that didn't carry a fire, those are also going to be tick hotspots. And sometimes when people burn, they think, oh, my ticks got worse. No, we burnt all the other grass, and then we put the cattle out there, and they went straight for those unburnt areas and soaked up all the ticks, right? So it's not that your burning didn't work. We just didn't really think about animal behavior and animal biology. And so that's really important. Eastern red cedars are another big one. Then when we sort of move to on-animal control, ear tags are going to work for ticks that are in the ear, and only ticks that are in the ear. Now, here in Kansas, we have a tick called the Amblyoma maculatum, which is the Gulf Coast ticks, which causes the gotch ear. So when they see animals' ears folding over, That's the Gulf Coast tick. If you put ear tags into the ear of the animal, that'll take care of that. It's not going to take care of any of the other ticks. And so for that, honestly, the best option is a pyrethroid or an organophosphate spray. And it's not terribly convenient, but it's the only way that you can get the product on the whole coat of the animal, right? And ticks like to be under the tail, under the arms, near that udder. When you do a pour on, you're just not getting the product moving through the skin enough to get to those areas. So a good spray is probably going to be pretty beneficial.
Do these control options also work for Asian longhorn ticks?
They do. And some of the mistakes that sort of people do is that they'll use a pour on. They'll think, okay, well, it says on the bottle I can use it for ticks, and they'll use a pour on. But we don't always, especially a pyrethroid pour on, get the kind of coverage that we need.
And while we're talking about ticks, needing to mention real fast the human aspect. And if people are finding ticks on themselves, what should they be doing?
They should be taking those ticks off as soon as possible, right? So the longer a tick stays attached, the higher the chance of you getting the alpha-gal syndrome and also any pathogens that they may transmit in. Because our most predominant tick in Kansas is the Lone Star tick, transmits a lot of pathogens, and it was also associated with the alpha-gal syndrome or red meat allergy. So the moment you get indoors from being outside, check everywhere, right? And I mean everywhere. These ticks like to get in folds of skin, check your hairline, have somebody help check you out. And then we want to just pull it off as quickly as possible. Just use your fingers, right? People get a little bit grossed out, but I always say there's nothing on an outside of a tick that can hurt you. Right? You can lick the tick and be just fine. Don't recommend it, but we don't need to be scared about touching them. And the reason why I say use your fingers is you've got grip strength, right? A tweezer doesn't always have grip strength. And so then what happens is you take a few tugs and the tick gets annoyed and, it can regurgitate some of that blood up into you and nobody wants that. So use your fingers, grab it as close to the skin as possible and just pull it away nice and cleanly. And then I always say pop it in the freezer. Right? Because if you come down with weird symptoms, flu-like symptoms in 2 weeks, we have the tick, we can identify what it is, which means we can narrow down what we think you may have, which is part of the battle when we're trying to diagnose if somebody has a tick-borne pathogen. And then you also have the tick. So we can test that tick in a lab. If somebody has got disease, we do that. And then it just really narrows down the options from a clinical standpoint.
Cassandra, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Wonderful.
That was K-State livestock entomologist Cassandra Olds. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Surveys show that dairy employees prefer training with a coworker or manager with skills in those areas over watching videos. In addition, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that safety training should be specific to the job an employee will be performing.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning the training that we do with our employees on our dairy farms. A lot of times we have various training programs we try to put our workers through, but there may be some points that you might want to consider as you think about what you're actually doing on your dairy today. Workers today generally like to receive some training, but how are you going to deliver that? If we look at some surveys that have been done with dairy employees, it might give us some insight as to how we might accomplish that and be most effective with it. Number one, generally participants will tell you that they would like to have on-the-job training. In other words, an experienced coworker or maybe the manager that has skills in that area to actually train them on the job as opposed to sitting and looking at a video. Yes, videos can be good and they can be part of the program, and many times they are. But we must also remember that it's important to do some on-the-job training with an experienced worker, someone that really understands what's going on and can provide the hows and whys to the procedures that we're doing. Sometimes an explanation is very, very important in helping the worker understand why we do things in certain ways and why we need to do that, both from an animal standpoint as well as from overall productivity and being efficient on our dairy farms. So those experienced workers that are providing that training need to be able to effectively communicate why we do certain things. This is probably very important in the milking parlor as well as other aspects of our dairy work as well. Some of the other things that we might want to think about is the difference between what is really going on your dairy and maybe the training videos that you might utilize to train milkers, say, for work in the milking parlor. Does the video you use or the books or the things that you have them read, does it really represent what is going on your dairy? There's lots of different ways to run a dairy, and generally you will find that dairies differ slightly in what they might expect in terms of a milking procedure or how they want the cows fed. There's many different things and differences that can be experienced when we look at different dairies. So how close does the actual training that you're providing actually match what is the reality of the day-to-day on your dairy and in that particular job? It's really important that you take that into consideration if your training is going to be effective. Some other things you might want to consider is that based on the survey, workers really do want to get training specific to their jobs. Many times our training videos and other tools might actually be more general and not really help with the day-to-day job that particular worker is expected to do. In addition to specific job training, workers also desire increased training in the area of safety. And it's important, again, that this training represents what really goes on the dairy farm. A lot of safety videos maybe that we can utilize really do not specify what's going on the dairy farm. So any safety training that you provide for your dairy employees should be specific to the farm as well as the equipment that they're expected to work with. This probably will result in the fact that you may have general safety training for workers, but then also some specific safety training for specific things that they will find in their particular area of work. It is important that this safety training be repeated, and many times probably some sort of annual program or refresher would be helpful to your workers. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider the training that they're providing to their employees and recognize that employees really do desire specific training to the jobs that they are performing on the dairy.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.